The morning that little Peter Wren saw the thing he was not meant to see began like any other in St. Mary Mead, with the smell of bread from Mrs. Larch's bakery, the clatter of milk bottles, and the gossip of the postmistress before 9 o'clock had even struck. The village, bathed in gentle sunlight and humming with the reassuring monotony of its routines, had never looked more peaceful. It was the sort of morning that made even the most suspicious souls feel at ease, which, of course, made it the perfect morning for something dreadful to occur. Peter Wren, a bright-eyed boy of 13 with a mop of chestnut hair and a perpetual look of mischief, worked part-time at Mr. Hardwick's butcher shop. He was a polite boy, though prone to curiosity. That dangerous, ungoverned curiosity, particular to children who have not yet learned when to look away. His job was simple: sweep the floors, wrap parcels, and make deliveries to the ladies of the village who never failed to tip him a penny if he smiled sweetly enough. That morning, as he hurried down High Street with a parcel of lamb chops for Mrs. Bartlett, he decided to take the shortcut by the churchyard. A path shadowed by yews and lined with ancient stones, leaning like weary sentinels. The shortcut was quicker, and Peter prided himself on speed. But halfway through the path, he slowed. Something caught his attention, a glint of sunlight on metal, half hidden behind a headstone. At first, he thought it might be a bicycle left lying carelessly. But no, it was something smaller, duller now that he came closer, and beside it, the shape of a man. Peter's breath hitched. The man lay sprawled, one hand curled over the damp grass, his face pale and strangely peaceful. His cap lay a few feet away, and his eyes stared blankly toward the church spire. The boy knew that face. Everyone did. Mr. Leonard Roper, the solicitor's clerk, whose precise manner and neat handwriting were the subject of admiration at the Women's Institute when he'd prepared their minutes last week. Peter stood frozen for a heartbeat, then dropped the parcel of lamb with a soft thud. "Mr. Roper," he whispered, as though the man might wake if he spoke kindly enough. But Mr. Roper did not stir. There was something terribly final about the stillness of his chest. Then Peter saw the thing that made his stomach twist. A dark stain spreading on the man's waistcoat, just over the heart. He bolted. By the time he reached the butcher's shop again, panting and pale as parchment, Mr. Hardwick had already begun to grumble about lazy lads who take twice as long as they ought. But the words died on his lips when Peter gasped out the news. Within 15 minutes, the village was alive with it. Mrs. Larch abandoned her loaves to overbake, Mrs. Bartlett fainted outright, and Miss Hartnell declared she had always suspected poor Mr. Roper was a shady sort. It wasn't long before Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham, summoned by the vicar, and already weary of what he called village excitement. He examined the body, confirmed the boy's account, and muttered something about a possible robbery. Yet, as was often the case in St. Mary Mead, the villagers' tongues worked faster than the official investigation ever could. By noon, it was said that Mr. Roper had been meeting a mysterious woman in the churchyard after dark. By 2 o'clock, that woman had become Mrs. Bartlett's maid, and by tea-time, the maid had vanished entirely, though in truth she was only visiting her sister in Brimley. Miss Marple, of course, heard the news quite naturally, over a cup of tea and a plate of scones at the vicarage. Mrs. Price Ridley had brought it up with great solemnity. "Terrible business," she said, dabbing her lips, though one can't be too surprised. Mr. Roper always did have that furtive look, like a man who hides things in drawers. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Many respectable people have secrets in drawers, dear," she said mildly, stirring her tea. "The question is only what kind." Reverend Leonard Clement, seated opposite, sighed. "A dreadful affair. Poor young Wren is beside himself. The doctor says it was a clean wound, a knife, most likely. And the inspector seems confident it's a matter of robbery. Roper was carrying a fair bit of cash yesterday, apparently." Miss Marple's blue eyes, mild but uncommonly sharp, flickered just slightly. "And yet," she said softly, "robbers are not usually so tidy about where they leave their victims. A churchyard seems sentimental." Mrs. Price Ridley frowned. "Really, Miss Marple, you do have a peculiar way of putting things." Miss Marple only smiled, her knitting needles clicking gently. "Human nature is a peculiar thing, dear. It very often chooses its places with care." That evening, as twilight settled over the village and the church bells tolled for evensong, a hush fell on St. Mary Mead. The police had taken the body away, but the sense of unease lingered like a low mist. Lamps glowed faintly in cottage windows, and curtains twitched as villagers whispered over their supper tables. And in the butcher's shop, Peter Wren sat alone in the back room, his hands clasped tightly together. Mr. Hardwick had told him to go home hours ago, but he couldn't quite bring himself to step into the street. For every time he closed his eyes, he saw again the pale, still face of Mr. Roper, and the small, glinting object that had first caught his eye. The inspector had taken it, of course. A penknife, silver-handled, with initials engraved faintly on the side. But Peter, in his terror, had not mentioned the other thing he had seen. The thing he was certain about now, though he dared not tell a soul. Because as he had turned to run that morning, he had heard something behind him, a voice, soft and low, from somewhere near the trees. A voice that said, quite distinctly, "Best not to look, boy. Best you forget." And though the voice was calm, it had chilled him more than the sight of the dead man ever could. Miss Marple, sipping her cocoa before bed that night, could not have known yet how vital that frightened boy's silence would prove to be. But she had already begun to think about Leonard Roper, and about the curious way in every village sin disguised itself as decency until something forced it into the light. The next morning, as the sun rose pale over the thatched rooftops, she resolved to pay a friendly call to young Peter Wren. After all, few things revealed the truth of human nature so clearly as the frightened honesty of a child. By morning, St. Mary Mead was a cauldron of whispers, boiling over with speculation, shock, and the peculiar delight that accompanies tragedy in a quiet place. Every lane hummed with conversation, every hedge, it seemed, was listening. The churchyard was now cordoned off with a length of thin rope that served more as suggestion than barrier. Villagers lingered just outside, pretending to pass through on errands but craning their necks all the same. Mrs. Bartlett, who had fainted so dramatically the previous day, now recounted her collapse to every willing listener, each time embellishing her tale with greater distress. "The poor boy ran straight to me, you know," she declared at the grocer's. "I was the first to hear, said he'd seen a dreadful thing, and I swooned clean away. Imagine, me, in my best apron." Miss Hartnell sniffed loudly over a crate of apples. "It's all very well to swoon," she said, "but the question is what a clerk like Mr. Roper was doing in the churchyard before breakfast. A decent man would be at his desk, not skulking behind gravestones." "And who's to say it wasn't an affair?" added Mrs. Larch, lowering her voice but not her enthusiasm. "Those quiet ones are the worst. He always looks so tidy, too tidy, if you ask me. A man that neat has something to hide." At the post office, Miss Weatherby confided to her assistant that she had noticed Mr. Roper receiving letters from London marked personal. "Thin envelopes," she said meaningfully, "the sort that hold more than friendship." By noon, the entire village had decided Mr. Roper was a man of double life. Respectable clerk by day, secret lover or embezzler by night. Only Miss Marple, walking home from the grocer's with a basket of apples and her usual calm expression, seemed unconvinced by the fervour. She paused at the vicarage gate, where the Reverend Clement was in conversation with Inspector Craddock, who stood in the shade of the chestnut tree, hat in hand, and a look of professional irritation on his face. "Morning, Miss Marple," the inspector said with a nod. "Quite the stir, this business. I'm hoping to bring it to rest soon. Straightforward, I should think. Robbery gone wrong. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Indeed, Inspector, though I do wonder what was stolen. I heard he had money on him for a deposit of some kind." "Yes," said Craddock, frowning slightly. "A sum of £30 in notes withdrawn the day before. Not a penny of it found on him." Murmured Miss Marple. "Curious. But robbery, you say? Then I suppose the thief must have known he was carrying it?" The inspector gave her a patient look, half fond, half resigned. "Now, Miss Marple, we've no reason to believe it's anyone local. Could be a tramp, or some chap passing through." The vicar cleared his throat. "A tramp here? My dear Inspector, one would have to walk a dozen miles before finding anywhere to pass through from." Miss Marple smiled again. "Quite so. And tramps don't often trouble to hush frightened boys, do they?" Craddock's eyebrows rose. "Pardon?" "Oh," she said lightly. "Young Peter Wren mentioned to Mrs. Hardwick that someone told him not to look. I dare say it was only his imagination, poor child. He's been quite shaken, I understand." Craddock's jaw tightened. "I see. That's the first I've heard of it. I'll question him again." "I'm sure you'll be kind," Miss Marple said gently. "Children remember more when they're spoken to kindly than when they're frightened." She left them then, walking up the lane to her ivy-covered cottage, where the pink roses bowed against the windows. Inside, she placed her basket on the table, made herself a small pot of tea, and sat down to think. To an outsider, Miss Marple looked merely like a kindly old lady contemplating her knitting pattern. But her mind was moving swiftly, fitting together the small oddities already apparent. Leonard Roper, a young man, careful, modest, without enemies by all accounts. A man of routine who had dined at the Blue Boar every Friday and taken the 8 o'clock train on Mondays without fail. Why, then, had he been in the churchyard before dawn? She considered the possibilities as one might consider patterns in a tapestry. Some drew the eye immediately. A secret meeting, a tryst, a delivery. But it was the smaller, subtler threads that most interested her. The silver penknife, for instance. Men didn't carry such things for fashion. Engraved with initials too, L.R. Perhaps a gift, or perhaps a possession reclaimed. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Peter Wren, his cap in hand, and his face pale as the milk bottles on his cart. "Come in, Peter," she said kindly. "I've just made tea." He hesitated in the doorway. "Mr. Hardwick said you wanted to see me, ma'am." "Yes, indeed. Sit down, my dear boy. You've had a dreadful shock, I hear." He sat, awkwardly folding his hands. "I didn't mean to see it, Miss Marple. It was there. I couldn't help it." "No one could, Peter," she said softly. "You did quite the right thing going for help. You're a brave boy." He looked up, uncertain. "Do you think they'll find who did it?" "Oh, I dare say the inspector will do his best," she said, watching him carefully. "But tell me, dear, when you saw Mr. Roper, was there anyone else about? Anyone at all?" He swallowed. "No, well, I didn't see them. But I heard something. A man's voice. It said—" He faltered. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "It said what, Peter?" "Best not to look, boy. Best you forget." That's what it said. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes, for an instant, grew very sharp. "How curious. And you're sure it was a man?" He nodded. Low voice. Sort of rough, like Mr. Hargreaves the gardener when he's been shouting. But I didn't see him. I just ran." "Quite right, too," said Miss Marple. "But you've remembered something very important, Peter. You mustn't worry about it. The truth, you know, has a habit of showing itself eventually." She gave him a slice of cake and sent him on his way, her mind already turning over the implications. A voice that spoke calmly, not in panic or haste. Someone who had not fled the scene immediately. Someone who had felt confident enough to speak, to control a witness. That evening, Inspector Craddock returned to the vicarage with an update that only deepened the unease. "We've checked Roper's lodgings," he said grimly. "Letters from a Miss Celia Dawes of London, romantic sort. But there's something else. A letter from his employer. Seems Roper had found irregularities in the accounts and meant to report them." Miss Marple, who had dropped in with a basket of black currant jam, paused in setting it on the table. "Irregularities," she repeated softly. What an uncomfortable word. Craddock nodded. "It could mean blackmail. Or theft. Could be our motive right there." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or it could mean something much simpler, Inspector. A man of conscience noticing what others preferred to ignore." The vicar glanced at her curiously. "You think he was silenced, Miss Marple?" She sipped her tea. "I think, dear Reverend, that in every tidy village someone always knows too much, and it's never long before knowledge becomes dangerous. Outside, the evening shadows deepened over St. Mary Mead, and somewhere far off, the butcher's boy shivered in his sleep, dreaming again of that low, warning voice in the churchyard. The next morning dawned pale and cold, with a thin veil of mist curling low over the hedgerows. The church bell had barely struck 8 before Inspector Craddock began his work in earnest. He was not a man given to superstition, but there was something about this particular case that unsettled him, the eerie calm of the victim's face, the peculiar neatness of the scene, and the lingering sense that something essential lay just out of reach. By 9:30, he had established his headquarters in the sitting room of the Blue Boar Inn. Its owner, Mrs. Pettinger, was delighted, of course. The attention lent her establishment a sort of prestige. "Inspector Craddock himself," she told the guests proudly. "We've never had proper police business in St. Mary Mead before, not like this anyhow." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had not been idle. She had written a short note that morning, a friendly one as all her letters appeared, to Mrs. Roper, Leonard's widowed mother who lived 2 parishes over in Old Mill. Within an hour, she had her answer, carried by the afternoon post. Mrs. Roper was heartbroken, naturally, and mentioned in passing that her son had seemed troubled of late about something at work. She added that he had written to her only 2 nights before, though she had not yet had the courage to read his letter again. Miss Marple folded the note neatly, placed it beside her teacup, and sat back. There was always something revealing in what people chose not to say. At the Blue Boar, Inspector Craddock had called in several villagers for questioning. The first to arrive, punctual as ever, was Mr. Harold Hardwick, the butcher, a large man with an honest face and the sort of hands that spoke of hard work and little imagination. "Morning, Inspector," he said, sitting stiffly. "Terrible thing what happened. Poor lad's been in pieces ever since." "You mean Peter Wren?" "Aye, won't go near the churchyard now. Keeps saying he hears things. Silly nonsense, if you ask me. But he's a good boy, he is. Wouldn't lie." Craddock nodded. "Did Mr. Roper come to your shop often?" "Sometimes for bacon on Fridays. Quiet fellow, always polite. Never said more than 2 words unless you asked him." "Did he seem troubled recently?" Hardwick scratched his chin. "Can't say he did, though he looked a bit pale last week. I remember thinking he'd been up nights, thought nothing of it then." Craddock dismissed him after a few more questions and jotted a note in his book. Roper, pale, anxious, perhaps threatened. Next came Mrs. Bartlett, still fluttering like a wounded bird and eager to be seen as intimately connected to the tragedy. "Oh, Inspector, I still can't believe it. To think that I might have been the last person to see that poor man alive. I saw him Tuesday evening, passing my gate, and he gave me the politest little nod." "What time was this?" "Oh, around 8. Or was it past? "No, perhaps 7:45. I was bringing in the washing, and I recalled the vicar's bell for evening prayer." Her recollection meandered for several minutes, full of embroidery and speculation, but little substance. Craddock dismissed her at last with weary politeness. After she left, he leaned back, rubbing his temples. The people of St. Mary Mead, he thought, would talk themselves into confessions of crimes they hadn't the imagination to commit. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Miss Marple entered, smiling faintly and holding her handbag like an elderly diplomat bringing peace terms. "Good morning, Inspector. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Miss Marple. I rather thought I might be seeing you today." "Well, it's only natural that one should take an interest," she said mildly, settling herself into a chair. "I've brought you something. Mrs. Roper's note. She was kind enough to write back to me this morning." Craddock blinked. "You've written to the victim's mother." "Oh, just a friendly word, you know," Miss Marple said, pouring herself a cup of tea from the tray Mrs. Pettinger had left. "I've always found that people will tell you far more when they think you're asking about their health than when you're asking about a murder." Craddock couldn't quite suppress a smile. "And what did she tell you?" "That Leonard had been troubled, and that he had written her a letter 2 nights before his death, which, if I may say, seems to suggest he had some matter weighing heavily upon him. People who write to their mothers when troubled are generally honest sorts, Inspector, but also rather naive." Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "You think he was taken advantage of?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "I think that those who mean to do wrong often seek out those who mean to do right. They complement each other in a sad sort of way." Just then, there was a commotion outside the inn. Raised voices, a quick shuffle of footsteps, and the door burst open to reveal Constable Ellis, red-faced and breathless. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we've found Summit, in the vicarage garden of all places." Craddock stood at once. "What is it?" The constable held up a handkerchief-wrapped object. "This, sir, found half buried behind the lilac hedge. Looks like blood on it." Unwrapping the cloth revealed a knife, not the silver pen knife from before, but a kitchen blade, longer, with a black handle. Dried blood darkened its edge. Craddock's brows furrowed. "Who found it?" "The vicar's gardener, sir. Says it weren't there when he weeded yesterday." Miss Marple, who had been quietly watching, leaned forward slightly. "Behind the lilac hedge, you say? How interesting. That spot's quite hidden from the road, but in full view from the vestry window." Craddock gave her a puzzled look. "You mean someone wanted it found? Or wanted someone else blamed?" she said softly. "The vicarage is a rather conspicuous place to dispose of evidence, wouldn't you agree?" Before Craddock could answer, the constable cleared his throat. "Beg pardon, sir, but the vicar's wife says she saw someone in the garden last night, around 9 o'clock. A man, she says, tall, in a dark coat." Craddock's face hardened. "Get a full statement from her, and tell the constable on duty to search every shed and outbuilding. If the murderer came back once, he might again." Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting into her bag. "If I may, Inspector, I should like to speak with Mrs. Clement myself. Women often remember small details they forget to mention to policemen." Craddock hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. But do be careful, Miss Marple. Whoever we're after isn't just clever. He's bold. Coming back to the scene, planting knives. That's the work of someone who enjoys the game." She smiled, her expression as mild as milk. "Oh, I've met that sort before, Inspector. They're not nearly as clever as they think. You see, there's always one little thing they forget. Some small truth they overlook because it seems beneath them." And with that, she left the Blue Boar, her step steady, her mind sharper than ever. For while the police hunted for knives and strangers, Miss Marple was already thinking of something far more telling, the quiet, deliberate voice that had told a boy to forget. Voices like that, she knew, belonged not to passing thieves or reckless killers. They belonged to people who believed they had the right to be obeyed. Inspector Craddock had a headache. He'd dealt with robberies, forgeries, even the occasional poisoning. But St. Mary Mead, he decided, was something else entirely. By the afternoon of the second day, he had already collected half a dozen conflicting witness statements, a bloody knife of uncertain origin, and an entire village's worth of theories. Each villager was convinced of someone's guilt, and none could agree on who. At the Blue Boar, the common room had turned into an unofficial council of inquiry. Over cups of tea and lemon sponge, the ladies of St. Mary Mead debated with an enthusiasm that bordered on ferocity. "It's plain as daylight," insisted Miss Hartnell, tapping her teaspoon with finality. "That young Peter Wren knows more than he's saying. You mark my words, he's protecting someone." Mrs. Bartlett gasped. Protecting? The poor boy's terrified. He's hardly eaten a thing, according to Mrs. Hardwick. "That proves my point," said Miss Hartnell darkly. "A guilty conscience always spoils the appetite." Mrs. Larch, who prided herself on balance, interjected, "And what about Mr. Hargreaves, the vicar's gardener? Didn't Mrs. Clement say she saw a man of his height in the garden that night? Tall, dark coat. Who else fits that?" At this, Miss Weatherby leaned in, eyes gleaming. "Oh, my dear, have you forgotten? Hargreaves was at the public house that evening. My cousin's husband saw him there, and he'd had 3 pints by the sound of it. Couldn't stand straight, let alone creep about planting knives." There was a pause as each woman reconsidered her position. Then Mrs. Bartlett, lowering her voice dramatically, whispered, "What if it was someone from the vicarage itself? People think vicars' wives don't have secrets, but I've always said—" At that precise moment, the door opened, and Miss Marple entered, serene as a summer breeze, her knitting bag tucked neatly under one arm. The chatter halted as if a bell had rung. "My dears," she said pleasantly, "what a serious gathering. I hope you're not frightening poor Mrs. Pettinger's customers with talk of murder." "Only trying to make sense of it, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Larch, flustered. "Everyone's so uneasy. Inspector Craddock says it may not have been robbery at all." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, I rather think it wasn't. Robbers seldom return to hide knives behind vicarage hedges, do they?" That silenced them for a moment. "But then who?" began Mrs. Bartlett. Miss Marple sat down, smoothing her skirt. "You mustn't let your imaginations run away, dear. Murder is never as strange as we wish it to be. It's usually a very ordinary thing. Resentment, fear, greed or love. And I suspect we shall find one of those in abundance soon enough." Her calm voice settled over the room like a benediction, though none could tell which of the 4 motives she found most plausible. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was conducting his own line of inquiry, beginning with Mr. Hargreaves, the gardener. The man was a sturdy fellow in his 50s with a weather-beaten face and hands like oak roots. "Hargreaves," said Craddock, pacing before him, "Mrs. Clement says she saw a man in the garden last night. You were seen at the Blue Boar earlier, but where did you go afterward?" "Home, sir," said Hargreaves flatly. "Straight home. Ask my wife if you don't believe me. She'll tell you I was snoring by 9:30. And your coat? You own a dark one?" "Yes, sir. But I've had it 10 years, and it's no secret what it looks like. Every man in the village has seen me wear it." Craddock eyed him keenly. "You knew Roper?" "Only by sight. Used to nod if we passed. Never had business with him, never quarreled with no one." Craddock noted the rough hands, the simple tone, and dismissed him, reluctantly. There was honesty in the man's eyes, but also something guarded. Still, it didn't feel right. Hargreaves was not the calculating type. By afternoon, Craddock had moved on to another interview, one that proved far more intriguing. Miss Celia Dawes had arrived from London, pale and trembling, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. She was, as the letters had suggested, Leonard Roper's sweetheart, or at least something close to it. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, voice quivering. "Leonard wrote me only last week. He said he was going to do something that might upset people, but was the right thing. I begged him to tell me more. but he wouldn't. "What kind of man was he, Miss Dawes?" Craddock asked gently. "A good one," she said quickly. "Too good. He hated deceit. It was why he left his last position. He found someone forging signatures, I think. He said he'd never be party to dishonesty again." Craddock nodded slowly. "And do you know anyone in the village he might have had trouble with?" She hesitated. "He mentioned someone, a man, who'd been asking questions about his work. I assumed it was about his accounts. Leonard said the man made him uneasy." "Did he give a name?" "No," she whispered, "only that the man had a scar on his cheek." Craddock frowned. None of his witnesses had mentioned anyone with such a mark. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting in the corner, with Inspector Craddock's reluctant permission, looked up now. "A scar, you say? Oh, how interesting. There are so few scars in St. Mary Mead, except for dear Mr. Flint, of course, who got his from that unfortunate incident with the cider press." Craddock blinked. "Flint, the inn's bookkeeper?" "The very same," Miss Marple said mildly. "Such a useful man to Mrs. Pettinger, though not, I fear, always as sober as he might be." Craddock made a note at once. Flint had access to accounts, to money, and quite possibly to temptation. When Miss Celia had gone, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "Do you really think Flint could be involved?" "Oh, my dear Inspector," she said softly, "in every small village there's one man who drinks a little too much, one woman who gossips a little too freely, and one person who notices rather more than is wise. I don't yet know which Leonard Roper was, but I should like to find out which of the others Flint might be." That evening the fog thickened over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the cottages in a muffled silence. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the flames flickering against the delicate china on her mantel. She reviewed the day's discoveries. A stolen sum of £30. A hidden knife, perhaps deliberately planted. A frightened boy, silenced by a calm voice. A man with a scar who asked questions about money. Patterns were forming, faint but certain. The sort that others missed because they were too eager to find drama in the obvious. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Human nature never changes," she murmured to the crackling fire. "A lie, a fear, a little pride, they all grow in such similar soil." Outside, somewhere down the lane, a figure moved quietly past her cottage window, tall, coat collar turned up, face lost to the mist. And in the morning, the village would learn that something else, something small but telling, had gone missing from Mr. Roper's lodgings overnight. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead awoke under a thin veil of drizzle. The streets glistened with wet cobblestones, and the air carried the faint aroma of peat, smoke from cottage chimneys. The murder of Leonard Roper, still fresh in everyone's minds, cast a quiet pall over the usually cheerful village. Even the birds seemed to sing more softly, as if respecting the silence of grief. Miss Marple, as ever, took her morning walk through the village lanes, her umbrella tucked under her arm rather than above her head. She preferred to feel the weather, not hide from it. Observing the village from ground level, she noted subtleties invisible to anyone rushing through life. The slight shift of a curtain when a neighbor passed, the anxious tightening of a hand, the faint marks of recent footfalls on muddy paths. Her first stop was Mr. Hardwick's butcher shop. Peter Wren, pale but determined, had returned to work, sweeping the floors with nervous energy. "Good morning, Peter," Miss Marple said gently. "I thought we might have a chat. Would you mind?" He shook his head, setting aside the broom. "Not at all, ma'am," Miss Marple smiled. "I hope you slept well." "Not really," Peter admitted, lowering his gaze. "I keep seeing him and hearing that voice again." "Tell me," she said softly. "Everything you remember, even the smallest thing." Peter took a deep breath. "When I ran, I saw something shiny near the gravestone, a piece of paper, I think. I didn't touch it. I was too scared. I just ran. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A piece of paper, and you didn't show it to anyone? No, ma'am. I thought I might get in trouble. Or he might come back. He told me to forget. She nodded, knitting needles clicking in thought. I see. You were wise, Peter, to trust your instincts, but sometimes the smallest piece of paper can tell the largest story. After a quiet moment, Peter added, I think I remember what it looked like. Like a note folded in half, and there was writing on it. Just a few letters, I think. Maybe L.R.? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Indeed. That would match Mr. Roper's initials. But what is far more interesting is that he would leave a note there at all. Most people who fear discovery destroy evidence or hide it in the most secret place. Leaving it visible, that is deliberate. Peter blinked. Deliberate? You mean he wanted someone to see it? Not exactly, Miss Marple said, rising and gathering her coat. He wanted someone to find it, perhaps to mislead them, or to protect something more important. She walked out of the shop with Peter trailing, heading towards the churchyard. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass slick and dark. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn not to the headstones themselves, but to the tiny, overlooked details along the edge of the path. Footprints that didn't belong, leaves displaced in a peculiar pattern, and a small indentation near a yew tree. She knelt down. The indentation was faint, almost imperceptible. But to Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. Someone had rested an object here, something light enough not to leave a deep mark, yet deliberate in placement. Peter peered over her shoulder. Could it be the note? Perhaps, she murmured, or perhaps something more revealing. She stood, brushing damp grass from her skirt. Peter, did you notice anything about the people near the churchyard yesterday? Anyone acting strangely? He thought for a moment. I saw Mr. Flint, the bookkeeper, coming out of the vicarage garden, but he looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected to see me. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Ah, curiosity and surprise often speak louder than words. By mid-morning, the inspector arrived, reporting that he had taken statements from every villager he could find, yet nothing concrete had emerged. The black-handled knife had been analyzed. Fingerprints were indecipherable, and Peter Wren, though nervous, had been too frightened to offer much testimony. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the blue boar with a plate of scones, observed him carefully. She noticed that he frequently glanced at the corner of the room where the firelight played, and his gaze lingered just a fraction longer on the bookshelves than it might have otherwise. A small habit, perhaps, but revealing in its subtlety. Then came the moment she had anticipated. Peter, speaking in a rush, added, "Ma'am, the penknife, the silver one, it wasn't in the churchyard. I think I saw it at Mr. Flint's desk when I delivered something for him last week." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-click. "Did you say Mr. Flint's desk?" "Yes, ma'am. I wasn't sure. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just a shiny penknife with L.R. on it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Thank you, Peter. That is quite important. It suggests that Mr. Roper's possessions were accessible to others, not just any thief, but someone close to him, perhaps someone trusted in the village." The implications were subtle, yet significant. Flint had motive, proximity, and access. But Miss Marple did not leap to judgment. That was never her way. She needed more than opportunity. She needed insight into human nature, into fear, into the hidden tensions that could drive a man to murder. Meanwhile, Craddock, upon hearing the boy's statement, looked uneasy. "I should have checked Flint's lodgings earlier," he muttered. Could this be why Roper didn't write his letters freely? Was he being watched? Miss Marple, sipping her tea, said nothing. Her mind was elsewhere, already tracing the invisible lines of secrecy and suspicion that connected the villagers. She knew that small, overlooked details. A penknife here, a voice there, the timid glance of a boy, often held more truth than the loud declarations of the self-important. And she also knew that in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, someone was desperately trying to conceal what they had done. That evening, as the rain began again, Peter Wren returned home. He slept fitfully, haunted by the voice in the churchyard and the shiny object he had glimpsed. Miss Marple, however, sat by her fire, calmly considering what she now knew. The silver penknife, engraved with Roper's initials, last seen at Flint's desk. The hidden black-handled knife in the vicarage garden. The voice that warned a boy to forget. The frightened boy himself, whose memory retained the faintest impressions of what others overlooked. In her quiet cottage, she murmured to herself, knitting needles poised over a fresh row of stitches. It is always the smallest thread that unravels the tapestry. One just has to know where to look. And somewhere, beyond the misty hedgerows, the first cracks in the killer's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. The following day brought a brittle wind that tugged at the hedgerows and rattled the windows of St. Mary Mead. The villagers, restless and uneasy, moved about with whispered speculation. The murder of Leonard Roper had begun to unravel the placid veneer of the community. Every glance carried suspicion, every smile hid a possible secret. Miss Marple, however, walked the streets with her usual measured step, observing, noting, and listening. She had long understood that in small villages, secrets were like ivy. They grew silently, climbing over fences and walls, and sometimes strangled the most innocent appearances. Her first stop was the vicarage. Mrs. Clement received her with a tremor in her hands and a polite anxiety that betrayed more than her words. "Miss Marple," she said, "I've tried to remember everything I saw last night, but it's all a blur." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, "the mind preserves what it needs to and hides what it does not." She paused. "You mentioned seeing a man in the garden. Tall, in a dark coat. Did you notice anything unusual about his movements?" Mrs. Clement hesitated. "He seemed deliberate, calm, not the sort of man one might expect to panic." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "Panic often gives away the truth. Calmness can be practiced, but it also betrays confidence." Mrs. Clement nodded slowly, as if realizing for the first time that someone's composure could signal intent. Next, Miss Marple visited Mr. Flint. She had been curious about the penknife, the boy's account, and the subtle tension she sensed in the man's demeanor. Flint was at his desk, meticulously arranging papers, the room smelling faintly of ink and old leather. "Good morning, Mr. Flint," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the chair opposite him. "Oh, I hope you're well. I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about Leonard Roper." Flint's hands paused. "Of course, Miss Marple. I knew him well enough, I suppose. A quiet sort." "Indeed," she said, studying him carefully. "He was well liked, as I gather. But tell me, did he ever seem troubled to you? Anything unusual in his manner or work?" Flint hesitated, then sighed. "He was careful, always checking and rechecking his accounts. And perhaps a little too curious. He asked questions that were none of his business. One or two people might not have liked that." Miss Marple nodded. "Curiosity can be dangerous, and sometimes, when a man is too careful, others grow impatient." Flint looked at her sharply. "Are you suggesting someone harmed him because of his work?" "I'm only suggesting, Mr. Flint, that the world often punishes those who notice too much, and those who trust too easily are sometimes most at risk." There was a silence. Flint's gaze drifted to the window, then back to Miss Marple. I didn't want to speak ill of anyone, but there were whispers. People unhappy with certain accounts being questioned. Leonard was very principled, perhaps too principled." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Sometimes principles are a dangerous possession, especially when combined with trust. After Flint left, Miss Marple continued her rounds, observing villagers as they went about their routines. The more she watched, the clearer it became that the village was a web of unspoken resentments. Mrs. Bartlett, still breathless with excitement, approached her. "Miss Marple, did you hear about the Clements cook? She saw Mr. Hardwick near the churchyard at odd hours. Isn't that suspicious?" Miss Marple raised a gentle eyebrow. Extraordinary indeed. And did she mention why he might have been there? "Oh no," Mrs. Bartlett said. "But everyone knows he can't resist a bit of adventure. Young Mr. Hardwick is always wandering. It's his nature." Miss Marple considered this, tapping her fingers lightly on her knitting bag. A wandering butcher might be harmless, or he might provide cover for someone else's actions. Motive and opportunity, she reminded herself, often overlapped. By late afternoon, the inspector convened another round of questioning at the Blue Boar Inn. Craddock, weary and increasingly frustrated, had little patience for conjecture, but recognized that Miss Marple's observations often carried insight beyond the obvious. "Mr. Flint," he said, "you mentioned people being unhappy with Leonard. Did anyone threaten him directly?" Flint shook his head. "No, not exactly. But I did hear someone muttering about settling accounts, someone who didn't like Leonard's carefulness." "And who might that be?" Craddock pressed. Flint's gaze dropped. I can't say. I only know it wasn't directed at me, but someone, yes." Miss Marple, watching quietly from the corner, made a small note in her mind. A vague threat, an unspecified target, a village simmering with hidden anger. It was a familiar, a pattern. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor. Peter Wren, clutching his cap, eyes wide with both fear and resolve. "Ma'am," he whispered, I think I know why Leonard was in the churchyard. I overheard Mr. Flint speaking to someone in the inn-yard the day before. He said something about making sure Leonard didn't find out. I didn't understand fully, but it seemed important." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers moving with deliberate calm. "And this is what I have been considering, Peter. Sometimes the loud threats are meaningless, but the quiet ones, the conversations overheard by a frightened boy, those are far more revealing." She leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what you heard, Peter. Every word matters. Don't leave out the small bits that seemed unimportant at the time." Peter swallowed. "It was brief, ma'am. Flint said, he asks too many questions. Best we settle this before it gets out of hand." Then he laughed, and that's all I heard." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The laughter was the critical detail. Casual, almost amused, but masking menace. It was the kind of laughter that accompanies a man confident in his power, confident that he has accounted for every risk. "Thank you, Peter. That is most helpful. You did very well." After the boy left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, letting the details settle in her mind. She reviewed everything carefully. Leonard's conscientiousness at work and the resulting enemies. The silver penknife, the hidden black-handled knife. Flint's access to the boy, the letters, and the accounts. The voice that silenced Peter, calm, deliberate, not fearful. A pattern began to form, delicate and precise. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking. In St. Mary Mead, it was never the grand gestures that solved a murder, but the quiet, overlooked moments. The small clues, the whispered threats, the casual laughter that disguised intent. And one person, she knew, had left far too many of these quiet signs, confident no one would notice. Except, of course, for Miss Marple. The morning fog lay thick over St. Mary Mead, seeping into every corner and softening the outlines of cottages, hedgerows, and fences. It was the kind of day when sounds travelled strangely, and shadows seemed to linger longer than usual. For Inspector Craddock, it was not a comforting atmosphere. His investigation had already twisted and turned like the narrow lanes of the village itself. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual calm, her eyes keen beneath the brim of her hat. She'd been awake since dawn, reviewing the facts in her mind. The penknife, the black-handled knife, the overheard words, and the frightened boy, all were pieces of a puzzle that until now seemed straightforward. Yet she knew better than to trust appearances. Small villages had a way of hiding complexity beneath their neat facades. At mid-morning, a new development shook the community. Peter Wren had vanished. Not a note, not a whisper, simply gone. The boy who had witnessed too much and spoken too little had disappeared from the butcher's shop and his home, leaving behind only his cap on the windowsill. The news spread like wildfire. Mrs. Hardwick was distraught, flinging herself into her husband's arms. "Oh, Harold, someone's taken him. He cannot have gone far. Who would dare?" Craddock was immediately summoned. His face, usually composed, showed lines of concern. "This changes everything," he said grimly. "A witness disappearing at such a critical time. Whoever's responsible may be trying to cover their tracks, or perhaps frighten the boy into silence." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner of the Blue Boar, tapped her knitting needles gently against her knee. "Or," she said softly, "he may have left of his own accord." Fear can be a powerful motivator, and when children hear too much, they sometimes think the safest course is to vanish for a while. "Vanish?" Craddock repeated. "From the whole village?" "Not necessarily far," she said, "but far enough to avoid being seen." They decided to start the search immediately, canvassing the lanes, checking hedgerows, and questioning anyone who might have seen the boy. Miss Marple joined naturally, though she moved with her subtle efficiency, noting signs that others overlooked. The impression of a small shoe on a muddy patch by the hedgerow, a snapped twig, the faint smell of freshly turned soil. Meanwhile, in the vicarage, Mrs. Clement made a startling discovery. While arranging the garden, she found a small folded piece of paper tucked beneath a flower pot. It was wet from the morning's mist, but still legible. It read, in a hurried scrawl, "He knows too much, do not let him speak." The words struck a chill through her. The paper was unsigned, but the handwriting bore a striking resemblance to Mr. Flint's careful, measured script, the same hand that had penned notes and accounts at the inn. Miss Marple arrived shortly after the discovery, carefully examining the paper. "Ah," she murmured, "the game grows bolder. Whoever left this is no longer content with subtle threats. They wish to manipulate events directly. But see here, the wording is clumsy. Men accustomed to concealment rarely write such blunt statements. They rely on intimidation, innuendo, or suggestion. This, I suspect, was written in haste." Craddock frowned. "So it is Flint?" "Not necessarily," she replied, "but it certainly points to someone who fears exposure and who has access to the boy." By late afternoon, Peter Wren was found, not abducted, as many feared, but hiding in the abandoned granary on the outskirts of the village. He had taken refuge there after hearing the footsteps of someone moving near his home during the early morning hours. When he saw no one following, he remained too frightened to return. Miss Marple spoke with him gently, coaxing details from his memory. "Peter, do you remember who you saw last near your home?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I think it was Mr. Flint. He came early, looked around, and whispered something about settling accounts. Then he left. I ran." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And did he see you?" Peter shook his head. "No, ma'am. I think he thought I was asleep, but I saw his shoes and the coat." Craddock was grim. "So Flint was at the scene more than we thought." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "But notice, he did not attack. He merely observed." Men like this prefer fear to violence at first. It suits their confidence and their style. This revelation, however, was only part of the twist. That evening, news came from the Blue Boar that Mrs. Bartlett's cat, an indifferent creature with a penchant for wandering, had returned from the vicarage with something clutched in its mouth. Another note, partially soaked and torn, addressed to Leonard Roper. Miss Marple carefully unfolded it. The note was brief. Do not trust appearances. The one who smiles may be the one who harms. Her knitting needles paused mid-click. The handwriting was not Flint's. It was more deliberate, more careful, but the phrasing suggested intimate knowledge of the village's social patterns. Someone was orchestrating fear, sending messages to frighten or mislead others, and it was clear the true culprit was confident that no one would suspect them. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. So we have two notes, both pointing in different directions, and Flint is acting suspiciously, but perhaps not guilty. Who else could be involved? Miss Marple tapped her chin gently. Inspector, consider the psychology here. One note was clumsy, a hasty warning. The other is deliberate, calculated, aware of human nature. One is the shadow, the other the hand that moves it. Do you see? Craddock's expression was tense. So there are two players? Not necessarily, she said softly, a faint smile playing at her lips. Sometimes one person can play two roles, the timid observer and the confident manipulator, but the truth, as always, lies in the details, the overlooked words, the small gestures, the fear that others dismiss. As night fell over the village, St. Mary Mead seemed quieter than usual. The wind rattled the windows, and distant church bells tolled in the darkness. The villagers went to bed, uneasy and unsure, while Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reviewing the day's revelations. She thought of the frightened boy, the two notes, and the subtle signals that had begun to point her toward the truth. A knot of suspicion was tightening, and the next move, she suspected, would either reveal the murderer entirely or create yet another, more dangerous twist. Somewhere in the village, behind a door carefully bolted and curtains drawn, the real killer smiled to themselves, unaware that Miss Marple had already begun to trace the invisible threads of their deception. The village of St. Mary Mead was cloaked in an uneasy calm the next morning, the type that comes after a storm has passed, but before clarity has returned. Miss Marple, as usual, was already at work, her keen eyes observing the slightest movements and expressions as she walked the familiar lanes. Today, her mind was focused not on collecting facts, but on testing her instincts and, more importantly, the people around her. Her first stop was the Blue Boar, where a subdued atmosphere had replaced the usual cheerful chatter. Craddock, having spent the night reviewing statements and notes, looked more tired than ever. Miss Marple nodded politely at him and took a quiet seat in the corner, knitting her latest project with measured fingers. She had decided it was time to play her final test. One could gather all the clues in the world, but without observing human reactions, the truth could remain hidden. She needed to provoke the killer, gently, subtly, to see who would betray themselves under the lightest pressure. Mr. Flint arrived soon after, his expression careful, polite, yet guarded. Miss Marple watched him as he ordered a cup of tea, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the rapidity with which he scanned the room. Noticing her gaze, he attempted a smile, but it faltered, just enough for her trained eye to detect unease. "Good morning, Mr. Flint," she said softly. "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you, Miss Marple," he replied, attempting casual chair. "Though these events, they do weigh upon one." "Indeed," she said, nodding. "It is strange, isn't it, how the mind clings to small details while ignoring the larger picture?" Flint raised his eyebrows slightly, but did not respond. Miss Marple continued, choosing her words with careful precision. "I was speaking with Peter Wren this morning, you know. Such a bright boy. though I must admit he has the habit of noticing far more than his age should allow. Flint's gaze flicked toward the corner where she had seen Peter earlier in the week, and he shifted slightly in his chair. "And do you think," she added, leaning forward just enough to make her presence felt, "that one must be very careful when young eyes and ears are around? One cannot always rely on what appears to be hidden, can one?" Flint's hands clenched imperceptibly around the handle of his cup. I do not know what you mean," he said, voice tight. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, of course. We all have such complicated days. But sometimes a casual remark can reveal more than one intends. People who smile easily, yet frown just for a moment when reminded of certain incidents. It is often the sign of a conscience at work." Craddock, standing nearby, frowned. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting Mr. Flint knows something?" "I am suggesting," she said softly, "that human nature tends to reveal itself, even when one believes it is concealed. We only need to observe carefully." Flint, who had been struggling to maintain composure, now looked decidedly uneasy. Miss Marple could see the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, the slight tremor in his hands. And then came the subtle flicker, a glance toward the door, a micro-expression that betrayed recognition, perhaps even guilt. "Mr. Flint," she said gently, setting down her knitting, "you have been very helpful to the inspector. But you understand, do you not, that the truth has a way of making itself known?" Flint swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. I do not understand, Miss Marple. Really, She allowed a pause, letting the silence fill the room. Even the clatter of teacups seemed to fade. Then she continued with quiet precision. "It is so curious, isn't it, that certain objects, a penknife, a note, even a pair of shoes, can become witnesses in their own right. They see more than we suspect, and they are not deceived by appearances." Flint's hands shook now, and his voice faltered. I did not." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, knitting bag resting on her lap. "It is perfectly natural to feel nervous, Mr. Flint. We all do when confronted by consequences we believe may be hidden. But the truth, as I have observed, has a way of slipping out in the smallest of gestures. A glance, a sigh, a twitch of the hand." He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, struggling. The tension was palpable. Craddock stepped closer, voice firm. "Flint, we need honesty now. Any attempt to mislead will only make matters worse." Miss Marple's eyes never left him. "Do you remember the notes, Mr. Flint? The one at the churchyard and the other brought by the cat. Each was written differently, yet both were designed to frighten and mislead. And the boy, Peter Wren, saw more than anyone guessed. Tell me, why should we not suppose that these threads all lead to you?" Flint's composure broke. He slumped in his chair, a deep sigh escaping him. His eyes, once guarded, now revealed defeat. "Yes," he whispered. I did it. I didn't mean to. I only wanted him to stop asking questions. Leonard knew too much about the accounts, and I thought I could scare him into silence. I did not intend." Miss Marple nodded calmly. "Intent is a curious thing, Mr. Flint. Often it begins as a minor act, a warning, a threat, a misdirection, and then, if unchecked, it escalates." Craddock stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Flint's shoulder. "You'll have to come with me now." Flint did not resist. His face was pale, the careful mask of civility shattered. Miss Marple, watching him go, reflected silently on human nature. The small, overlooked actions, the whispered threats, the subtle manipulations, they had been enough to reveal the truth. Once Flint was gone, she returned to her chair, picking up her knitting. The village outside seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, though a faint unease lingered. Secrets, once revealed, never vanished entirely. They merely changed form. Peter Wren, safely returned home, would soon learn that his courage had helped uncover the truth. And the villagers, oblivious to the quiet intelligence of their oldest observer, would resume their daily routines, none the wiser to how close they had come to allowing fear and deception to dominate their lives. Miss Marple, as always, remained serene. She had set her test, watched carefully, and allowed human nature to reveal the answer. In St. Mary Mead, as in all places, she knew the smallest gestures carried the weightiest truths. The following morning, a crisp, pale light filtered through the mist over St. Mary Mead. The village was unusually quiet, as if the air itself waited for the events of the previous day to settle into memory. News of Mr. Flint's confession had spread slowly, filtered through whispers at the Blue Boar, the churchyard, and the grocer's shop. Some were shocked, others unsurprised. For in small villages, everyone carries a sense of who is capable of what. Miss Marple, walking her usual route, paused near the vicarage. The garden, now freshly tended, displayed the quiet orderliness of a community striving to regain normalcy. Yet she knew that beneath the tidy hedges, the echoes of fear and deception still lingered. She had arranged to meet Inspector Craddock at the Blue Boar that morning, determined that the full story be clarified before the villagers began to speculate and distort. The room smelled of freshly baked bread and brewed tea, a comforting scent that belied the seriousness of the conversation to come. "Miss Marple," Craddock began, "I must say the confession was thorough, but there are still pieces that do not quite fit. I would appreciate your insights on the matter." She nodded, settling herself with her knitting bag on her lap. "Of course, Inspector. It is essential that the truth be understood, not just acknowledged." "Very well," he said. "Where do we begin?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Let us start with the simplest observation. Leonard Roper was meticulous, careful, and conscientious. He noticed details others ignored, and that made him a threat to someone who preferred secrecy over accountability." Craddock nodded. "That would be Flint. His accounts had irregularities, and Leonard's questions made him anxious." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but let us consider the subtler elements, the black-handled knife in the vicarage garden, the silver penknife, the notes discovered in separate locations. Each tells a part of the story, but none in isolation. It is the connections that reveal the truth." She laid out the timeline carefully. Leonard had been observing financial discrepancies, voicing his concerns to friends and colleagues in his quiet way. Mr. Flint, possessing access to Leonard's correspondence and personal effects, first attempted subtle intimidation. The note warning the boy, the whispered threats, the clumsy message tucked under a flower pot. And then, she continued, the act escalated. When Flint realized that Leonard's scrutiny could not be diverted, he confronted him in the vicarage garden. The black-handled knife was intended not necessarily to harm immediately, but to create fear, to assert control. Leonard, however, did not flee entirely. He retained his courage. That is why Peter Wren saw him and why the silver penknife came into play. It was Leonard's own, left inadvertently, a clue not to mislead, but to expose the presence of another. Craddock leaned forward, frowning. So Flint staged it to look less direct. "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "Notice the psychological pattern." Flint used small, calculated gestures. The notes, the warnings, the careful movements in the churchyard. He relied on human reaction rather than brute force, believing that fear alone would suffice to suppress discovery. "And the boy?" Craddock asked. "Peter Wren." "He was crucial," Miss Marple said, voice gentle but firm. Peter observed details that adults often ignore: a glance, a footstep, a voice. Flint underestimated him entirely, assuming that children are easily dismissed. Yet it was the boy's memory, the shiny penknife, the overheard words, the fleeting observations. that revealed the connection between Flint and Leonard's final hours. Craddock nodded slowly. And the two notes? One, hastily written, clumsy, a warning to frighten. The other, deliberate, calculated, designed to mislead. Both came from the same source. Flint himself. The discrepancy in style is telling. The careful manipulation of human emotion rather than physical evidence, that is Flint's signature. A clever man indeed, but one who leaves patterns behind, patterns visible to those who know where to look. Miss Marple paused, then added quietly, "Observe, Inspector, that Flint's demeanor throughout this investigation, his calmness, his controlled fear, the subtle gestures of avoidance, all betrayed him. Confidence in concealment often produces inadvertent signals. It is a simple truth. No man can entirely hide from careful observation, especially in a village where everyone is watched, if only in passing." Craddock leaned back, absorbing the meticulous reasoning. So it all fits. The motives, the methods, the escalation. Flint's careful orchestration of fear, his attempts to manipulate the boy, the misdirection of notes. It all points to him as the murderer. "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, "and it is only by watching human nature, by noting the faintest gestures and the smallest inconsistencies, that we can untangle the web of fear and secrecy." Just then, Peter Wren entered the inn, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the pride of participation. He approached Miss Marple, who offered him a gentle smile. "You did very well, Peter," she said. "Your courage and your observations helped reveal the truth. Sometimes, even the smallest witness carries the largest burden and the largest reward." The boy nodded shyly. I wanted to tell what I saw, ma'am. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt." Miss Marple patted his hand. "And that is precisely why the truth emerged. Courage, honesty, and careful attention, qualities far more powerful than threats or deception." Inspector Craddock, standing by, sighed with relief. "It's over." "Finally." "Yes," Miss Marple said, looking out the window at the village bathed in the soft morning light. "But remember, Inspector, the appearance of peace is often just that, an appearance. In St. Mary Mead, as in all places, human nature hides secrets beneath even the most ordinary of facades. Today, the pattern has been revealed. Tomorrow, who knows?" And with that, the village settled back into its routines. The tension lifted, though a subtle unease lingered. The memory of fear, of deception, and the quiet genius of one elderly woman who had, once again, untangled the hidden truths of human behavior. By mid-afternoon, St. Mary Mead was slowly returning to its accustomed rhythm. The crisp air carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the bakers, mingled with the faint tang of damp earth from the gardens and hedgerows. Life, it seemed, would continue, but not without a subtle imprint left by the recent events. A whisper of unease, a quiet awareness that even the most ordinary people could harbor extraordinary secrets. Miss Marple walked along the familiar lane toward her cottage, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She greeted villagers with a soft nod or a gentle "good day," her presence a comforting reminder of normalcy. And yet she observed everything: the way Mr. Hardwick adjusted his hat, the slight tension in Mrs. Clement's shoulders, the careful pacing of Mr. Flint's temporary absence from public view. She understood that the village, though outwardly calm, carried undercurrents of curiosity, reflection, and lingering anxiety. Inside her cottage, she sat by the fire, examining the small items she had collected over the course of the investigation. Peter Wren's penknife, the torn notes, the black-handled knife that had started the entire chain of events. Each held its own story, each whispered of human intentions, fears, and miscalculations. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Peter Wren entered cautiously, cheeks flushed and eyes bright, clutching a small bundle of letters. "Ma'am," he said, voice trembling slightly with excitement. "I wanted to bring these. They're letters Leonard wrote to friends and neighbors. He kept them for his own safety, I think." Miss Marple took the bundle, her fingers brushing over the delicate handwriting. "Ah, Leonard was prudent, and prudent people often leave traces of themselves behind, just as those who act deceitfully do." She smiled at the boy. "Thank you, Peter. You have done remarkably well." Peter beamed, then hesitated. Do you think the village will ever be the same?" Miss Marple considered this. "In some ways, yes. But in others, no. St. Mary Mead will return to its routines, and the gardens, the tea tables, and the lanes will seem unchanged. Yet beneath that, people will remember the lessons learned about trust, observation, and the small but significant ways in which human nature can reveal itself." Later, as the sun dipped low behind the hedgerows, Miss Marple ventured into the village square. Villagers were cautiously resuming their daily activities. The grocer arranging apples with meticulous care, Mrs. Bartlett sweeping her doorstep, children chasing one another in games, laughter cautiously returning. The recent events had left them more vigilant, though few understood the full intricacies of the investigation. Mr. Flint, escorted quietly back to the manor by the constable, had offered no resistance, his face pale and his eyes avoiding the gaze of anyone he passed. For the villagers, his downfall would be a lesson in appearances and the dangers of hidden intentions, though none would fully comprehend the psychological subtleties Miss Marple had observed. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement had begun tending to her garden once more, planting new blooms where fear and uncertainty had briefly cast their shadow. She paused occasionally, gazing toward the horizon, perhaps reflecting on how courage and honesty, qualities so often overlooked in ordinary life, had unveiled the truth. Miss Marple returned home, lighting her lamp and settling into her favorite armchair. She reflected on the entire affair, the careful observation of small gestures, the subtle cues that betrayed intentions, and the extraordinary courage of a small boy who had seen more than he realized. Leonard Roper's fate, tragic though it had been, had revealed the intricacies of human nature and the importance of attentiveness, patience, and wisdom in discerning truth from pretense. She thought, too, of the village itself. Its outward calm, masking hidden tensions, its ordinary residents capable of both kindness and duplicity. In her mind, she traced the patterns once more, noting how one small misstep, one poorly judged threat, had led to such a cascade of events. Human nature, she knew, was a tapestry woven with threads both visible and concealed, and it required care and understanding to untangle. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her hands moving with the familiar rhythm that had always soothed her thoughts. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into evening, unaware of the quiet vigilance that had preserved its safety and unveiled the truth. And in that gentle stillness, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Once again, she had observed, waited, and understood, allowing human nature itself to reveal what words, threats, and appearances could not. Tomorrow, the village would resume its routines, the memory of fear gradually fading. But the lessons remained, like the invisible stitches in a carefully woven quilt, the importance of watching, of listening, and of understanding the delicate but profound truths of human behavior. And Miss Marple, ever composed, ever patient, would remain there, quietly watching, quietly knowing, ready for the next subtle disturbance to the peace she so diligently cherished. The days following Mr. Flint's arrest brought a cautious normalcy back to St. Mary Mead, yet Miss Marple could sense the subtle ripples left behind by the recent events. Villagers walked more slowly along the lanes, casting furtive glances toward one another as though each had reconsidered how well they truly knew their neighbors. Conversations were quieter, less certain, and always touched by an awareness of what could lie beneath the ordinary. Miss Marple, meanwhile, resumed her routine with her customary serenity. She visited the grocer's, stopped at the post office, and wandered along the village paths, but her eyes were ever alert. Every expression, every hesitation, every small gesture spoke to her as clearly as words. Even in the return to normalcy, she observed patterns others failed to notice. Peter Wren, now safely ensconced in his home, became a small figure of fascination in the village. Children whispered about his role in unraveling the mystery, though he bore it with quiet pride. Miss Marple had taken a moment to sit with him and explain that courage was not measured by grand acts, but by noticing small truths and acting upon them, even when fear tried to hold one back. Peter's eyes, bright with understanding, reflected the gravity of her words. In the vicarage, Mrs. Clement worked in her garden with renewed vigor. The blooms seemed more vivid than ever, as though they had absorbed the lessons of vigilance and prudence. She paused occasionally, reflecting on Leonard Roper's careful nature and the subtle signs he had left for those willing to notice. The garden, with its orderly rows and hidden corners, became a symbol of the balance between appearances and truths, a balance Miss Marple had always recognized in human behavior. At the Blue Boar, villagers gathered with cautious optimism, sharing tea and bread as they exchanged accounts of the past week. There was relief, certainly, but also a collective understanding that small communities held small secrets and that each person was capable of more than they seemed. The innkeeper commented quietly on the extraordinary calm of Miss Marple throughout the turmoil, a calm that both reassured and mystified the villagers. Inspector Craddock, now freed from the immediate pressures of the case, met with Miss Marple for a final discussion. "Your observations were remarkable, as always," he said, folding his coat across his arm. "I have spent years investigating crimes, yet I find your approach subtle, patient, and so attuned to human behavior, consistently ahead of mine." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Inspector. It is not the evidence alone that speaks, but the way people respond to it. Fear, guilt, confidence, they all leave traces, often where one least expects them, and the smallest observers, like Peter, can sometimes reveal what adults overlook entirely." Craddock nodded. "Indeed. And Flint? He believed himself clever, but even clever men leave a trail." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Confidence in concealment is often a poor companion to careful observation. Even the most meticulous planning cannot account for human insight, especially in a community where eyes and ears are attuned to subtle shifts." Later that day, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting and reflecting. The case had reinforced her understanding of St. Mary Mead's intricate social tapestry. A place where appearances masked intentions, where whispered resentments simmered beneath polite conversation, and where courage could be found in the quietest of observers. Leonard Roper's meticulous nature, Flint's manipulations, and Peter's bravery had created a narrative that, while tragic in its beginnings, had ultimately revealed the enduring truth about human nature. Miss Marple's mind wandered over the minor details that had proved pivotal. A glance, a hesitation, a careful phrasing, the discrepancy in handwriting, the trembling of hands, the fleeting fear in a young boy's eyes. Each was a thread in the larger web of the mystery, threads that, when carefully followed, led her to the heart of the truth. The village itself, bustling now with the ordinary routines of trade, gardening and social visits, seemed almost unchanged. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, subtle shifts had occurred. Relationships would be re-evaluated, small suspicions quietly remembered, and the awareness of human complexity would linger in the minds of those involved. Even in this quiet aftermath, she remained attentive. Villagers might believe that life had resumed its familiar pattern, but she knew that small ripples of events lingered long after the immediate crisis passed. She could detect them in the way people carried themselves, in their cautious smiles, in the glances exchanged across the village green. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the cottages and hedgerows in gold and amber, Miss Marple settled in her chair, her knitting moving steadily. In the quiet of her cottage, she reflected on the lessons of the past days, that human nature, though predictable in its patterns, remained endlessly complex, that courage and observation could overcome even the most calculated deception, and that the ordinary, in its subtlety, often held the key to extraordinary truths. Outside, St. Mary Mead exhaled, returning to the rhythm of village life. Yet a gentle awareness lingered, a whisper of the extraordinary concealed within the ordinary, a memory of fear and revelation, and the quiet presence of a woman who had once again seen what others had overlooked. Miss Marple, calm and composed, remained at her window, knitting and observing, ever ready for the next secret, the next hidden truth, the next quiet disturbance of the village's fragile peace. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a gentle, almost reverent hush. The streets, once alive with hurried footsteps and whispered speculation, were now quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The village had returned to its routines, yet the echoes of the recent events lingered, like a faint fragrance that refused to vanish completely. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her cozy sitting room, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. The warm glow illuminated her calm face as she reflected upon the twists and turns that had brought clarity to the troubling events of the past days. Each piece, from Peter Wren's keen observations to the calculated misdirection of Mr. Flint, had woven a pattern that was as intricate as the stitchwork of her own knitting. She considered the subtle human truths that had guided her throughout the case, the signs of fear, the gestures of guilt, the small, revealing inconsistencies that spoke louder than words. Each villager, no matter how ordinary they seemed, had played a role in the unfolding drama, whether through inadvertent revelations or the quiet courage to act rightly. Peter Wren's bravery, she thought, had been a quiet marvel. Children often see the world in ways adults overlook. Their simplicity and honesty can cut through deceit with surprising clarity. The boy had observed, remembered, and acted with a courage far beyond his years. Miss Marple smiled faintly, remembering how carefully he had recounted the details, his young mind piecing together events in a way that adults might have missed. Flint, by contrast, had been blinded by overconfidence. His meticulous attempts at concealment were undone by the smallest gestures, the slightest tremors, the unguarded moments that spoke volumes. In the end, it was not physical evidence that exposed him, but the subtle interplay of human behavior, the telltale signs that Miss Marple had learned to read over decades of quiet observation. The village itself, though outwardly unchanged, had been altered in ways invisible to most. There was a new caution in conversations, a more attentive gaze in interactions, and a faint undercurrent of respect for the observant mind that had unraveled the mystery. Life would continue, gardens would be tended, tea would be poured, and yet the memory of the events and of the quiet triumph of insight over deception would endure. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Leonard Roper, the meticulous and conscientious man whose observations had triggered the chain of events. Though his fate had been tragic, his role in revealing the underlying deceit had been vital. Sometimes, she mused, the noblest acts come quietly, without recognition, leaving only subtle ripples in the lives of others. She reflected, too, on the power of ordinary observation. In small villages like St. Mary Mead, secrets are often hidden in plain sight, and truth emerges not from grand displays, but from patient attention to the smallest details. A glance, a gesture, a carefully chosen word. Human nature, she knew, was consistent in its inconsistencies, predictable in its unpredictability, a paradox that, when understood, could illuminate even the darkest intentions. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the hedgerows. In the quiet, she felt a deep satisfaction, not in triumph over malice, but in the restoration of balance. The danger had passed, the lesson had been learned, and the village could once again proceed with the unassuming dignity that characterized its daily life. Yet she also understood that vigilance was never complete. Small villages, with their intricate social webs, always held secrets and concealed truths. People could be charming, polite, and ordinary on the surface, while beneath lay ambitions, fears, and resentments waiting for an opening. But for now, all was as it should be. The misdeeds of one individual had been exposed, justice had quietly prevailed, and life could continue without further disruption. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her fingers moving rhythmically, weaving the wool into neat, deliberate patterns. Each stitch seemed symbolic, a quiet reflection of the order she had restored in the tangled web of human behavior. She thought of Peter, the villagers, and even Mr. Flint, whose errors had inadvertently illuminated the subtle truths of the community. Outside, the night deepened, and a gentle wind stirred the hedges and trees, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and earth. St. Mary Mead rested, peaceful and yet vigilant, a village shaped not only by its daily routines, but by the quiet insight of one woman who had seen beyond appearances, understood human nature, and guided events to their rightful conclusion. Miss Marple set down her knitting at last, leaning back in her chair. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Another mystery had been unraveled, another subtle web of deception revealed, and yet the ordinary rhythms of life would carry on. Unchanged, yet forever touched by the lessons of courage, observation, and human truth. And so, in the warmth of her cottage, with the village silent outside and the fire glowing gently, Miss Marple reflected once more on the quiet, inexorable patterns of human behavior. For her, the case was concluded, but the understanding she had gleaned, the insight she had exercised, and the truth she had revealed would endure quietly, like the faint hum of life in St. Mary Mead itself. The case of the butcher's boy who saw too much had come to a close, leaving St. Mary Mead with the outward calm of village life restored, but with an indelible impression beneath its surface. The events had reminded the villagers that even in the most ordinary settings, human nature carries both the capacity for courage and the inclination toward deception. Miss Marple's quiet genius had once again prevailed, not through dramatic displays or scientific evidence, but through careful observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of the subtle signals human behavior reveals. Every glance, hesitation, and minor gesture had contributed to unveiling the truth. The story of Leonard Roper, Mr. Flint, and the brave young Peter Wren woven into a tapestry of human interaction, deceit, and integrity. The resolution reinforced a timeless lesson. Appearances are rarely all that they seem. Ordinary people, everyday routines, and commonplace objects often conceal secrets that only the most attentive eyes can discern. And courage, even in the smallest observer, can be decisive in revealing what others overlook. St. Mary Mead returned to its routines. The gardens were tended, tea poured, and conversations resumed. Yet, beneath the tranquility, the village now carried the subtle awareness of what had transpired, the memory of fear and revelation lingering quietly, like the scent of lavender in the evening air. Miss Marple, ever composed, returned to her quiet life, knitting by the fire, observing and reflecting. For her, justice had been served, human nature understood, and the delicate balance of the village restored. A reminder that even in the smallest corners of the world, insight, patience and quiet courage can illuminate the darkest of truths. And so, as the stars twinkled above St. Mary Mead and the night settled in, the village slept, ordinary, peaceful, yet forever touched by the extraordinary presence of Miss Jane Marple, who had once more seen what others could not, and guided the threads of human nature toward clarity and justice.